For a week, the world had been erased by snow. It fell not in a fury, but with a slow, hypnotic persistence, burying the hard lines of the prairie until the fence posts stood like skeletal fingers reaching from a grave. The wind was a whetstone against the windows of Jedediah Boone's ranch house, but the fire inside crackled and spit, and the lantern on the porch held its flame, a steady, golden vigil. Jedediah lit that lantern every sundown. It was a ritual, same as currying his mare's coat or etching the names of fallen friends into the barn's support beams. Not a habit, but a debt, a promise made to a woman who now lay under the frozen ground, a promise that had outlasted her. No rider had challenged this white emptiness in weeks. The trail was a ghost, lost to the drifts and the profound silence. So when he saw the two shapes moving against the horizon, dark smudges on a canvas of white, his first thought was of wolves. But then one of the figures faltered, and the other, taller one, caught it before it fell. They were human. They wore what looked like stiff deer skin and shawls worn thin as cobwebs, their feet bare against the snow. Jedediah remained on the porch, a silent silhouette beside the swaying lantern, the light caught in their eyes, making them glint like startled animals. They stopped at the edge of his yard, hesitant, poised between desperation and fear. Jedediah raised a hand, a slow, deliberate motion that was not quite an invitation, but was far from a dismissal. It was an acknowledgement. It was enough. The older one, a young woman herself, gave a slight, cautious nod and guided the younger girl toward the barn. He pulled the heavy door open for them, the scent of hay and livestock spilling into the frigid air. They slipped inside without a sound. He didn't follow immediately. He stood in the biting wind, feeling the cold seep into the leather of his boots, his eyes scanning the swirling snow behind them. He watched for a pursuer, a third figure coming to claim them. There was only the wind and a silence that felt ancient and absolute. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the smells of damp hide, dry straw, and the distant tang of wood smoke from the house. The girls huddled near his milk cow, who merely shifted her weight, unbothered. Jedediah placed a tin mug of hot coffee on a nearby post and left as quietly as he came. He didn't know if they had English. The older one took the mug. Her hands were raw and split from the cold, and a fine, pale scar bisected her lower lip. Her eyes didn't plead, they measured him. She offered no thanks, but she didn't spill a drop. As he turned to go, the younger one, little more than a child, murmured something in a language he did not recognize. The older girl offered no translation. Back in his house, he left the door unbolted. Sleep was a distant country that night. He sat in his rocker, letting the fire burn down to embers, the rhythmic motion a silent companion. Outside, the snow muffled the world, yet the girl's whispered word echoed in his mind. At dawn, they were on his porch, huddled together like half-frozen sparrows. He opened the door before their knuckles could touch the wood. With heads bowed against the cold, they stepped over the threshold. He gestured to the hearth, and they moved toward its warmth. It was hours before the trembling left their hands. He saw now that the younger one favored her leg, a subtle, pained limp. The older girl gave her the room's only chair, settling herself on the floor without complaint. Jedediah boiled some beans and gave them the last of his bread. They ate with a careful, controlled grace that spoke of pride, not just hunger. Still, he asked no questions. The sun was a pale disk in the sky, rising and setting again. On the second morning, the younger girl's fever had passed. Jedediah left a basin of water on the porch. When he came back from splitting firewood, the older girl had washed her sister's hair and had hung their damp shawls to dry near the fire. He leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, and watched. For the first time, she met his gaze directly, and there was no fear in it, only stillness. She stood and walked toward him. "Shanoa," she said, her voice soft but clear. He blinked. "My sister," she added, nodding toward the girl in the chair. "Talisa." He nodded back. "Jedediah." The name sounded foreign on her tongue. She tried again, softer. "Jed." This time, it settled. Later, as he saddled his horse for a ride to the general store, Shanoa followed him to the gate. The snow had returned, delicate flakes catching in her dark, braided hair. "You will return?" she asked. It was a question, not a demand. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. He gave a single, sharp nod. "I light the lantern every night." She tilted her head. "For what reason?" He offered no answer, just swung into the saddle and rode away. The town's general store was colder than the open prairie, a chill that came from words, not weather. Clovis Hatch, the blacksmith, cornered him by the flour sacks. "Heard you got company, Boone." Jedediah said nothing. Clovis spat tobacco juice onto the floorboards. "Comanche, I reckon. Runaways. Means trouble either way." Jedediah bought his supplies: flour, salt, jerky, and a small tin of cherry tobacco. The shopkeeper's eyebrows shot up. "Expecting the snow to last, Jed?" "It depends on how long it wants to stay," Jedediah said, his voice flat. When he returned, Shanoa was at the gate. Her eyes noted the tobacco, but she said nothing, only took it from his sack and placed it on the kitchen shelf with a reverence usually reserved for scripture. That evening, he noticed the curtain in the main room had been mended. The stitches were small and neat, the work of hands that remembered a life of finer things. He said nothing, but before turning in, he hung his late wife's old scarf on a peg by the door. It was blue, the color of a winter twilight, worn soft with time. The next morning, Shanoa was wearing it. It was wrapped around her neck as she stirred the pot of beans. Talisa sat at the table, sounding out words from a tattered book Jedediah hadn't seen in years. The house was no longer just a shelter. It felt inhabited. He found himself lingering, listening to the simple sound of another's breathing. That night, after Talisa was asleep, Shanoa joined him on the porch. The snow fell softly, landing on her bare shoulders. The blue scarf was a stroke of color in the monochrome night. "You are a quiet man," she said. He nodded toward her. "So are you." "This place," she said, her gaze sweeping over the white expanse. "It is safe." He hesitated. "It's still part of the world." He looked out into the darkness. "But safer than some parts, yes." Shanoa trained to him, her breath a white plume in the cold. "You have been alone for a long time. 12 winters." She looked down. "I remember the fire in my family's lodge, the smell of stew, my mother's songs." Her voice frayed. "Then the traders came. They did not want furs, they wanted girls. My uncle sold us for rifles." She looked up, her eyes clear. "You never asked." "I've seen enough in my life to know when not to stare," he said, his voice rough. Her fingers brushed the back of his hand, a touch as light as a falling snowflake. "Do you think we can stay?" He didn't answer with words, but when he went inside, he left the door unbolted once more. 3 days later, the sheriff's horse appeared through the snow. Jedediah was fixing a fence post. Shanoa stood on the porch, a silent sentinel. Sheriff Arlen Crowley was a fair man, but not a soft one. "Town's talking, Jed," he said, dismounting. "They say you're harboring Comanche girls." Jedediah didn't flinch. "They're not being harbored. They're guests." Crowley's eyes shifted to Shanoa, then back to Jedediah. "Are they your responsibility, Boone?" Jedediah's jaw tightened, the silence stretched. I'm not turning them out into this. That's not what I asked, the sheriff said, his voice firm. The words came out solid as iron. She's mine. The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. Then you best make it official before men like Clovis Hatch get any ideas. He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving tracks that were quickly swallowed by the snow. Jedediah turned back to Shanoa. She walked down the steps and stood before him in the snow. Your law, it says I must marry? It does. Then you will give this to me again, as a man gives a wife a gift. He took the fabric, his calloused hands trembling slightly as he wrapped it gently around her neck and tied the knot. There was no talk of love, but in that quiet, weathered gesture, a promise was made, and a new life began. That night, he lit the lantern as he always did, but for the first time, he wasn't alone as he watched it glow. Chenoa leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. Inside, Talisa slept soundly under a warm quilt, and the wind, howling across the endless prairie, no longer sounded of sorrow. It sounded like a song.